So good afternoon, everyone. When Ferky and Ben reached out to me relatively recently and said, hey, Richard's coming up to give a talk, would you moderate? I would say, well, I'm actually in Pittsburgh the day before. And I said, sure, why not? In the neighborhood, right? So this is a total blast because I've known Richard for quite some time and have really enjoyed the interaction with him on so many aspects of city and metropolitan growth in the United States and around the world. And we share a lot of similar perspectives, both on what has fueled the rebirth of cities, but what fundamentally can change the trajectory going forward. And so we're in one of these moments that our CIA director calls a plastic moment. They happen several times a century, where everything is just basically thrown up in the air. You know, we've been through a pandemic. We're dealing with a new world order, geopolitical tensions with China, wars in the Ukraine, and now Israel. We're dealing with other dramatic, tumultuous dynamics which happen on almost a weekly basis. And then there are cities and metropolitan areas where every day the mayor and the county leader and networks of business and philanthropic and community leaders have to deal with wicked challenges, like the decline in downtowns because of remote work or because of housing and homeless challenges and so forth. So today we're going to try to basically talk about how does cities and metropolitan areas design, finance, and deliver the next generation of city building amid all this tumultuous change, and with the federal government, which has just unprecedented truckloads of money. Of course, where is that money? But we will talk through that as well. So I just wanted to start, because I think it'll be sort of a window into a world, to talk to Richard about what he's working on today. And because I think that'll give you a sense, not just what he's thinking about, but what a whole bunch of other cities and metropolitan areas want to basically design going forward.
Well, thanks, Bruce, and thanks for that incredibly warm and kind and generous introduction. It's great to be with all of you today. Yeah, I'm kind of an honorary Pennsylvanian. I spent more than 2 decades in this state, down the road where you came from in Pittsburgh. I taught at Carnegie Mellon, where I held the Heinz Professorship, the reason you were there. And I've been to Erie before, not for a while. So it's come an incredible way. But I think there was a governor from here once. Am I right? And that governor took a flyer on me when I was a very young professor and named me to the Team Pennsylvania Board of Directors. The other thing that's relevant, very relevant to all of you, which is the one thing that no one mentioned, is I'm from Newark. And Newark shares many similarities with Erie. I think in many respects it was even more hard-pressed, more downtrodden. My experience growing up there shaped and influenced, we can talk more about that too. That's why I became an urbanist. I saw my city, I saw the factory. My dad had a 7th grade education, worked in a factory. I saw that once bustling factory decline and deindustrialize, and my dad and everybody else have to go and find different work. I saw my city besieged with racial unrest and riots and occupied by tanks. But it also had this tiny little insurance company. I don't remember the name of it. It's Prudential. That also, like you, and I think that the two of you, Erie and Prudential Insurance, need to be recognized as really path-breaking and trailblazing city builders, because when so many other corporations did the easy thing and moved to the suburbs or to another city, you all stuck it out. So this experience of what you've done in this city and what Prudential did in Newark is very important. What am I doing? I mean, the pandemic, like most of us, caused me to refocus my work, Bruce, and I really have been thinking about what life will be like and what the post-pandemic city will be like, and my 2 cents on that is Cities have survived far worse. Urbanization is the most powerful force in human history. It's the force that brings us together, from which we develop modern basic languages, rudimentary tools, rudimentary cave arts. It's where our first trading ports emerged. It's where we developed great industries. It's where we became modern societies. So look, we've gone through world wars, major natural disasters, plagues, pestilence, and survived, and we will survive again. We'll just be different. The other thing I'm working on, which is kind of far afield, is how the digital economy changes things that I wrote about. So I'm involved in a very, very big study of the creator economy, which is about the digital online creators that, they used to do this in the analog world, and what that means for places and cities. And then a big project on what digitalization means for cities. One last thing, and then we'll have a conversation. I've come to change my view. It was very interesting to hear your introduction. I still believe everything I said there. But in Pittsburgh, I was arguing against massive public investments in stadia that I believed at the time were not important to attract the creative class. Guess what? Now with the pandemic and empty downtowns, and the fact that workers are no longer coming to work, I believe that on the global scale and on the local scale, destinations and attractions are much more important than I originally believed. And I think my argument against destinations and attraction was a bit of a mistake. So I found that very interesting to listen to you. It doesn't mean that we don't have to do all the other things that I mentioned, but I do think now that destinations and attractions are much more important now than they were then, and they probably were important before as well.
That was a perfect segue, because you and I just walked through this incredible several block area with the Erie Downtown Development Corporation, right? The food hall, the climbing wall. I mean, I'm afraid of heights, so I'm thinking about, okay, I'm not doing this, but I'm sure some 15-year-old's gonna do it. But I've actually, like you, and I want you to talk through what remote work means for what central business districts and downtowns have been for a long time. But like you, in Philadelphia, I've been thinking the 76ers need to come near Chinatown. Yeah, I mean, we've got to think about feet on the street. We've got to think about demand. So how does remote work, first of all, is it structural, is it cyclical, and what does it mean for these great cores of our cities?
It's structural, and it is a phenomenon related to a larger trend, which is digitalization, and the fact that we can work online, learn online, buy things online. I often say to my wife, because she thinks I'm an introvert, she's an extrovert, I'm a bit of a hermit. I say, we've heard all this talk about a 15-minute city where you can do everything. I say, well, Rana, my wife's name, I live in a 1-minute city called my house. I work online, I get stuff delivered online. She goes, but you should come to the store, go eat. I'm like, no, I live in this 1 minute, I have a gym in the basement. Now, that's a silly way of saying these digital tech. I learned this at Carnegie Mellon. 25 years ago when I walked in the door, this kid from New York City, coming from Columbia University, and Raj Reddy, an infamous professor there, said to me, we were going to have ubiquitous computing anytime, anywhere, anyplace, anywhere. And I said, what moon are you from? And everything he said in the late 1980s came true. Every single thing he said. So remote work is part of it. And of course, the pandemic caused this giant experiment. So I actually dug in. That's when I began to write about this. In March or April, I actually wrote a piece that came out in May that said the biggest impact of the pandemic wouldn't be on how we live and where we live, it would be on central business districts. My view is that the traditional central business district is one of the last relics of the industrial age. The first relics, factories, moved out of cities in the 70s and 80s. The packing and stacking of people in office towers, once we learned that we didn't need to do it. So Nick Bloom, who's the biggest expert on this, he believes that we will end up with about 20% of workdays done remotely. He just wrote a piece in the New York Times in which he says he thinks that we're in equilibrium now, and that if anything, remote work will increase, not increase a lot, but increase a little as people get more used to it and as companies that doesn't mean that we won't have offices. Of course we will have offices. People are social animals. Central business districts are transforming. And again, this is another way I've revised my views. When I wrote my book, Rise of the Creative Class, the subtitle was, "And How It Is Changing the Way We Live, Work, and Play." I would like to take that title back. It should be How It Is Changing the Way We Live, Work, Play, and Connect. What cities really are connection machines, and that's why I say it's no longer a central business district, it's a central connectivity district. Your colleague, Paul Levy, who runs the Center City Philadelphia district, just published a new study that I'm writing up for City Lab now. It's a study of 26 downtowns in the United States, from big ones like New York City to smaller ones like Memphis. Here is the conclusion, and this is why the 76ers and attractions matter. Workers make up about 20% to 25% of downtown activity. Residents who are increasing, and by the way, every downtown in America, save for one, has more residents today than it did before the pandemic. It's an incredible thing. Phoenix is the only one with just a couple percent less. Residents make up 10 or 11. Visitors make up over 60% of all activity in downtown. That's telling you something. So that what downtowns are really the gathering places in our communities. And increasingly these large, small, not just large, smaller events like this, larger events, if you're lucky enough to have a university or college in your downtown, or more than one, that's spectacular. And that's right, these destination attractions are really, really important to really galvanize your community as a gathering place or as a center of connections.
So I want to start with a major U.S. city and then come to Erie. I want to start with San Francisco and sort of get your thoughts on what's been called the urban doom loop. So San Francisco was sort of building back their core. They had Salesforce has several towers, et cetera. But as we moved to remote work, a lot of the technology workers, which is a different kind of sector than the financial sector, insurance, et cetera, they went back to their homes and their pajamas and haven't emerged since. And so what you have is this sort of logical sort of parade of, okay, the workers stopped coming to downtown San Francisco. They stopped taking the BART, their transit system, so there's like a whole fiscal crisis in the transit system. Then you move to small businesses, which depended upon local folks being downtown. Well, those begin to collapse. And then you ultimately get to tax revenues, which service an entire city. So that's the urban doom loop, right? And San Francisco is at one end of the continuum. So talk about San Francisco just a bit and what it might tell us about Erie, Pittsburgh, et cetera.
So in the long view, I'm not at all worried about San Francisco. I'm not at all worried about New York. I'm not at all worried about Chicago. In the short run, there are some really pressing issues. So in this study I mentioned that I'm writing up, so you'll be able to see it next week on City Lab, San Francisco has been among the most hard-pressed downtowns in the United States. It has lost a large share of work. Its recovery of workers has been slower than others, and its recovery of visitors have been slower. That's what I presented to the U.S. Travel Association last week. And they said visitors still very much want to come to San Francisco. It always ranks, it continues to rank about one of the highest destinations, and I believe that local folks, here's what I think happened in San Francisco. I think on the one hand, they have a high share of, I think it isn't a San Francisco problem per se, that San Francisco was hit with more of a problem that hit every downtown. For one, San Francisco has a much higher share of its workforce in knowledge-intensive technology industries. Compared to a place like Nashville, Nashville has recovered the best, which has a much smaller share of its economic base in those industries, and much more reliance on hospitality and tourism and things that are done locally and people have to show up. The second thing that people forget, but you know better than me, because we both did this at the same time, San Francisco rode a wave of attracting high-tech workers, knowledge workers, the creative class that began in the year 2000. Let's do the math. If somebody was age 21 in the year 2000, and we know from other research that attraction of the creative class back to downtowns really accelerated after 2010, how old were those folks in March of 2020? They were right smack in the middle of their family formation years. What happens in America when people have families? They, like my parents did, they moved from Newark, New Jersey to a suburb with more space, more affordable housing, and in their view, accurate or not, access to better schools. So San Francisco was hit with this demographic time bomb, this economic time bomb and demographic time bomb. That said, San Francisco is now massively increasing its share of venture capital investment. I track this data, I'm a geek. It's now the metro, which includes the consolidated metro, which includes San Francisco has more venture capital investment and more startups than the Silicon Valley by almost a factor of 2 now. But the consolidated metro is up over 40%, and San Francisco per se has far and away, look, so many people have wanted to prove that Pittsburgh and Toronto, 2 cities that I love, were catching San Francisco as centers for artificial intelligence. They're not. They're growing their own, which is spectacular. But San Francisco is the largest cluster. So what's his name? Benioff said the other day, he has never seen so much demand from tech companies for tech space. That said, I don't think San Francisco is going to rebuild its downtown as an office-centric downtown. I think it's going to rebuild its downtown, and I think the ULI just did a report on this, as a center for entertainment, for recreation, for connection, for meetings, for conventions. And look, I think that we're all part of this. But the other thing I want to say, it's not like downtowns haven't changed. I mean, there's a great book by Robert Fogelson. Here's the title. The title is amazing. It's called Downtown, Its Rise and Fall, 1880 to 1950. He thought the modern downtown was toast in 1950. We have just continually remade it. First it was a trading hub, then it was an industrial hub, then it was an office hub, then it was a retail hub, then it was a residential hub and a mixed-use hub. It's just being reinvented again, and I think it will continue to be reinvented in new ways, and different kinds of cities will pioneer that.
So let's come back. We're going to come back to some of what's happening in San Francisco that is under the radar screen, because what happens in the U.S., we're a very large country, and the media tries to simplify everything. And then we really do try to beat up certain places, so it makes us feel better about our own places, I suppose. But the bigger picture of why San Francisco has a future is because besides remote work, we're also reshoring production. We're remilitarizing. A lot of what's happening in San Francisco is defense tech. And we're decarbonizing, right? Without any national plan, but boatloads of federal money. So reshoring, remilitarizing, and decarbonizing all at once. Don't try this in your own country, right? But before we go there, let's just talk a little about Erie's downtown, because you put out a couple concepts about where downtowns as central cores and connectivity districts near to go. Play that out just a little bit for a small and medium-sized place and what that might look like. And then we'll go to some of these other trends.
Well, it's really funny. I wrote Rise of the Creative Class 20 years ago now because I was really mad at Pittsburgh, a city I love, because Pittsburgh is such a beautiful city with so many assets and so much going for it, yet all of my students at Carnegie Mellon wanted to leave. And the reason they wanted to leave was to go to Austin. And I was like, I love Austin, but I'm like, ick, Austin? Are you kidding me? Like, Pittsburgh's a real city with real beautiful buildings and real beautiful libraries and real beautiful museums, ick. And they wanted fun, and they wanted street-level amenities, and they wanted to be able to, do things that young people do, and they loved a college town. And then, I must have been 15 years later, I wrote another book called New Urban Crisis, and I went off on a book tour. And I went to all these small towns, small cities and towns across America. And I realized they had caught up. Like, it wasn't just New York and San Francisco and Paris and London that had cool things. All these small towns had cooler things. And the reason they did is because the space was more affordable. They had more interesting local restaurants. I was just in Asheville, North Carolina. They had 2 James Beard award-winning restaurants in their downtown that looks by the way, very similar to your own. All over America, there had been this revolution. And I think what we saw was during the pandemic, these are precisely the kinds of places that became appealing. It wasn't the traditional, nothing wrong with it. I grew up in one. It wasn't the traditional suburb that was appealing. It was this kind of smaller town. Now, that could be a city the size of Nashville, it could be the city the size of Asheville, it could be the city the size of Erie, but it was these communities that had an urban fabric and a core. In Nashville, I went to Franklin last week for the first time, and I saw that. This is the kind of thing that was really appealing to people. And I think if you're fortunate enough, like you and I, Bruce and I we did a lot we kind of invented this idea of anchors. And if you have anchors in and around your downtown, like a university or a college, and like a big employer, that gives you, and I would say a third, philanthropy, that gives you enormous advantage to put together. And what you've done, the achievement you've made here in the 20 years, to me, it's unrecognizable. I mean, you see it every day, but there's a pretty long passage of time. It's completely unrecognizable what you've achieved. And I actually think you've just looking around, you've laid the foundation for what's next.
Yeah, I think the first time I came here was in 2002. And I remember going down to the bayfront and going up that tower and almost be blown off because I think it was the wrong part of the year. And there wasn't a lot going on. But when you think about this core, and you think about UPMC, and you think about Gannon, and you think about Erie Insurance, and you think about your waterfront and the proximity to the lake, and you think about State Street, whoa, you've got this incredible set of assets that are very unusual for a place this size, and they're all hugging the same territory. So the question is, how do you light it up?
And intentionality really matters. And you've been intentional across these several anchors in philanthropy. And I think, I didn't mean to interrupt you, you can continue, but I think you've been intentional, and you could just let it happen to you, or you can intentionally shape your future. And you've had this incredible resilience and intentionality.
So one thing, and we were talking earlier today about all this national spending that's coming. And what's interesting about this federal moment of investment, it's that it's coming for nation building, right? It's investing in infrastructure, it's investing in climate, it's investing in manufacturing, it's investing in innovation. It's not coming directly to redo downtowns or redo commercial corridors or deal with the housing crisis. So the national government has said, here's money that's coming for these things, but not for those. So it's abundance and scarcity, and you figure it out. If you need to regrow your cores, well, here's the money you have: climate, manufacturing, innovation, and infrastructure. So if you're going to bend it to redo your cores, you'll have to basically do a little, hard work here. And as you're thinking about how central business districts and downtowns, or broader, greater downtowns, are coming back, are there certain activities, purposes, firms that now, or residential, the mixes of uses that really need to now populate these places? And then we're just going to have to do some new math to figure out how the money over here is going to move over here.
Well, I mean, I think we've seen just today walking around in your downtown what those new uses are. Downtowns are not just containers for living, residents, or working. They are that. They're containers for connecting. And what did we see? This incredible new wellness, healthcare, fitness, and climbing wall facility, and a food hall. Those are the uses that matter. Those connective uses. Like when you saw people start to gravitate to co-work, people don't want, here's another Nick Bloom statistic. People that work from home don't work from home. What do you mean? They work from co-working spaces, libraries, restaurants, cafes, or a friend's house. We are social animals, we crave connection. So thinking about those connective spaces, two kinds of spaces really matter for that: downtowns and waterfronts. I have a big new report that will probably get me driven out of Toronto on Toronto's waterfront and the lack of things happening there, and why that waterfront is Toronto's future, and why it needs to have not only wonderful passive parks where the bees and the birds can go during the 5 months of winter when it's just horrible. It needs massive major attractions, and we need to think about that. So you have a downtown and a waterfront. What are uses? Well, first of all, Bruce is very modest. There would not be this shift in Biden policy if it wasn't. Bruce is one of the architects of this. He will not give himself credit or take credit, but we wouldn't have this shift if it wasn't for you and a group of people like you. This idea that you could do innovation or technology or industrial policy with a place-based element is just a testimony to his incredible work. I would have gotten tired of smashing my head against that bureaucracy, but Bruce, it's a credit to you. Look, the 31 tech hubs that were just announced, it's unbelievable. And we did a little math today. 40% of them are in the Heartland of America. 40% of them, 12 of the 31 are in the Heartland. They're not in the coast. They're in, everywhere from Pennsylvania to upstate New York to Tulsa, Oklahoma. We can go down, and it's incredible because all of those communities are galvanizing themselves. And here's one more for you. I actually think that a large part of the future of this country rests on its universities and colleges. And I've just finished a report for Heartland Forward on this, which will be coming out. I did a report for the governor of Michigan analogously. And I argued in that report, let's talk about the Michigan one to Governor Whitmer, that the future of Michigan hinges on Detroit, a city I love, where so many of my kids' cousins live. But I said that really the future of Michigan hinges on its college towns. If you think about almost every major technology or innovation cluster that's come out of America, it's come out of a college town and then spread. Well, we have about, look at the number of college towns we have in America. So I think of this connection between Gannon, you mentioned UPMC, the kind of activities and clusters they can host, the kind of innovations they're working on, and the way in which they can help spearhead that. I think that's, and it doesn't have to be cutting edge, and I want to make mention of this. I've been working in Tulsa, Oklahoma for 5 years now, and the conversation in Tulsa has a leading edge effort to attract remote workers. It's built one of the great public spaces in America, the award-winning Gathering Place. It has the Woody Guthrie Museum, and it has the Bob Dylan Archives, all great things. The one thing they don't have is a major university or college. So the conversation there was, how can we become a first-class innovation hub without one? They just won one of the 31 tech hubs. They have Tulsa University and they have a couple of branch campuses, but they don't have an R1 research. It can be done. And I think this is really important. So thinking about the kinds of activities you can do, and I think this, look, to put the nub on it, for too long, our country has focused and built up innovation hubs on its coasts, along the New York, Washington, Boston, Acela corridor, in Southern California, and a little less so in Seattle and the Bay Area, more so. Now these new technologies create the capacity to really, and those technologies are transformative in that they're linked to actually making things. This is the part of the country that makes things, not those coasts. So yeah, I actually think there will be, not just a reshoring, but I think we're going to see the resurgence of this part of the country in a way few have anticipated.
So a couple folks are walking around. You can write your questions down. I'll see if I can read your handwriting. But I think what you're doing is you're drawing a connection between the physical city, the quality of place. I mean, what we just saw walking around, the core, Perry Square and what's happening there, and the enterprise city, the innovative city, the creator city, and what now needs to be a much higher level of connectivity for all these folks who may be working in office, may be working at home, but crave really getting together because that's where ideas generate.
Bruce, there's another part of this which is interesting, which I never talk about, and I never really think about it, but there are psychologists who've looked at mobility patterns, and psychologists who've looked at the connection between our mobility, our personalities, and the places we choose to live. I grew up in New Jersey, and we know that people who are very likely to move and who like big cities are one of two types. They're either highly open to new experience, which I am, or highly extroverted, high in extroversion like my wife. The people who tend to stay, and highly open to experience people and extroverts tend to focus on the next new thing, whether that's semiconductors or biotechnologies or the next art form. There are several other personality types that are very important to building things. They're conscientious, diligent, and agreeable. Those people tend not to move. They tend to stay around home. Our heartland is filled with that, and you know it when people were saying, people in Pennsylvania are nice, people in Michigan are nice, people in Minnesota, you can go down the list. These are the places that historically, because they had raw materials, but because they had a good work ethic, which is connected to the personality type of their people, make things. If you're going to rebuild this country and get away from this silliness that it's the next new thing, you're going to have to make stuff. And what's so interesting to me is, for most of my time at Carnegie Mellon, the cool things to make were iPhones and social media devices and internet searches devices. Now, with these transformative technologies, like the car, the electric battery-powered connected technology, and we could go down the list. Big things are now really interesting again, and you're not going to make them in New York City or in San Francisco or in Boston. You're going to make them across. Will it be the same heartland as before? No. Will it stretch down south a little bit into parts of Ohio and Kentucky? And of course. But I think what we're seeing, and all of those places need hubs, right? That no one's going to go there and build their factory there. You know, where did Intel build its new semiconductor? Columbus, Ohio. You know, which is kind of an interesting place, rebuilding itself and remaking itself around Ohio State University. So yeah, I think every one of them is going to need a hub, but it's going to be this is going to be the most, I think this is going to be the most interesting next couple of decades of our lives.
So this may be the most important part of our conversation, and then I want to talk about inclusion, and then we're going to look at a bunch of questions. But the economic philosophy of the United States is changing almost overnight because of these big macro forces that are unleashed in the world. And we're going from a theory of ultra efficiency, offshore everything, outsource everything, globalize everything to bring it home. That doesn't mean we're not going to have trade or we're not going to have international investment, but it may not be with China dominating, but with Mexico and Vietnam and with Korea and a whole bunch of other countries. This is the future of the heartland, because you can't have reshoring without innovation, right? You can't dominate these next technologies without innovation. And where's that? It's going to happen around universities, in close concert with companies, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, and I think what's so interesting is someone who's now spent nearly 20 years in Canada and just drove. I mean, when you then think about the power of North America, with the resource economy and the space in Canada, I think Canada now, we have about 14% of our population is foreign born. I think Canada's up over 20, and Toronto's up over 50. You think about that, you think about the proximity of here to Canada, you think about Detroit and Windsor, and then you think about Mexico as a site for lower cost or more efficient manufacturing. You've got a powerhouse on your hand. And I do think that, Bruce, everything that you say, that the United States has realized that it has to bring this stuff back, and also for its own stability. It can no longer just have this unbalanced economic growth on the coasts. You have a country that's pulling apart largely because of that, largely because so much of its growth and innovativeness and its wealth has been concentrated in these little areas, and people feel like their parts of the country have been falling behind. They get mad. I mean, it makes perfect sense. You don't have to be a rocket scientist to figure that out. So yeah, I think we're going to find that we'll pull more together, and that technology and industry and communities are all part of a virtuous circle. That you need innovation applied to manufacturing that takes place in real communities for the society to work. Look, are we there yet? No. Do we have plenty of hurdles to go through? Of course, but I don't know. Even though I think the point you made about these moments is really important. Here's what my dad said. My dad had a 7th grade education. My dad didn't get to go to high school because he had to go to work to help support his family. My dad, put down his tools in the factory and went off to serve his country during World War. By the way, One of my best friend's father put down his pencil at Harvard Business. This is amazing to me. On the same day, our two dads, his dad at Harvard Business School, my dad in the factory in Newark, did the same thing. They walked down to the Army enlistment office. And my dad always said when he came back from the war, he said, never underestimate the capacity of the United States to remake itself. He said, when I enlisted, they gave me a doughboy helmet and a broomstick, and they said, go train. And he said, by the time he got to Europe, you should have seen the ships filled with tanks and armaments and all the stuff coming off our assembly lines. Look, we're pretty good at this. We're not perfect, we have plenty, but we're pretty good at this as a country. And I think we're in one of those moments now. I really do. And you guys are a microcosm of it. The way in which you put together the local anchor institutions, the universities, the corporate, the local philanthropy, and made this mixture, there's just something fast and flexible about this country. So I actually think this is a very positive moment. Look, there's a lot of issues, but I think it's very positive.
So there's a great quote in the Financial Times a couple of weeks ago: militaries win battles, economies win wars. That's why the U.S. is still the most powerful nation on the earth. Now the question comes, this is a real, and these are the questions that are coming up here. How do you we're really good at innovation. We are going to reshore, right? How do we make this inclusive? One question. Erie has a 44% child poverty rate. What policy and development solutions do you recommend? Erie needs to grow its population. How do we make that equitable in ways that don't push displacement? Are any cities dealing with homelessness? We have racial wealth gaps that really came to the fore after the murder of George Floyd, right? So inclusion, diversity, equity, how does this get baked into this national moment?
Oh, I mean, the American dilemma. I mean, we're not the first to confront this. Our dilemma has long been poverty and race, and we've certainly not figured out a way to solve it. It's something we have to take super seriously. Let me give you my take, which is a little different, because I come from a pretty poor family. Like, I had kids late in life. My kids are 6 and 8. And when I show them where I grew up, they can't imagine that I would have come from there. Like, when I show them where I'm from, the little house that we grew up in, they're like, no, that can't be. You couldn't have grown up there. So what I'm saying is I understand this. I saw kids left behind. I'm the only kid. I got a Garden State scholarship to Rutgers College, and it changed my life. I saw a kid after kid left behind. They were smarter than me. I'm a guitar player. They were better guitar players than me. They were better athletes, but they just didn't get a break. And my take in Rise of the Creative Class is that every human being is creative. And in this new kind of economy, we are wasting talent. It's not like just the 40% of us who have the great opportunity to be members of the creative class. It's the 60% who are, but we've never found a way to harness their energy. And we just have to make it our mission to find a way to harness this. Look, I live in Toronto. We certainly have inequity and we have issues of race, but they don't look like this. It's this, we have to make a commitment as a society to engaging everyone. I can tell you a couple things just from Toronto. We have provincially funded public schools. So I'm at my daughter's 8th birthday party on Sunday, sitting next to a nanny of some other kids in our neighborhood. And I start talking to her. She's like, yeah, my daughter's 19. She's in London. Okay. She grew up in Toronto and went to school and went to Queen's University, which is in Kingston, and is now in London on a semester abroad. And that is the typical story. That's not the unusual story. She was Canadian, African descent. Her daughter was in London on exchange program, provincially funded schools and equity across the schools, a healthcare system that everyone has access to, a system that has social inequity but doesn't have the social inequities. We have to commit to that. And somehow, Bruce, I think it goes back to your comment before, that we have this belief, this Horatio Alger mythology, that everyone can rise up, but some people can't. So we have to make a commitment to that. And I think what you and I can do is build inclusive, and I think we've done that. I think to your credit, you might want to talk about this. In some of the federal programs, we have built a modicum of inclusion. I think we have to do more because every one of these moments, when we invent a new kind of economy, it tends to become winner take all. The same thing happened in the Industrial Revolution with the robber barons. Yeah. And then during the Great Depression, we decided we had to create mechanisms, public policy mechanisms, and institutional mechanisms to spread the benefits. I think that's where we are now.
I'll just give you 3 examples, then I'll ask a few other questions. So in St. Louis, Missouri, not surprisingly, Boeing is growing its industrial production at the airport, city-owned, right? But it's putting an applied R&D and workforce hub into North St. Louis, which is about 98% African-American, one of the most disinvested, devastated parts of our country. So Boeing, major global company, says we need an R&D workforce, we need an R&D hub, and we need a workforce. Why aren't we pulling this out of North St. Louis? And why don't we have more of our supply chain firms in northern St. Louis? When you think about Intel in Columbus, Ohio, what Intel needs now is a workforce. So they're working with Ohio State and working with community colleges, again, reaching into neighborhoods to train that workforce. And last piece, El Paso, Texas, on the border with Juarez. Because of Fort Bliss, it's a major part of our military industrial complex. Who's gonna maintain the base? Why don't we have Latino firms who are centrally involved in the construction space do more of defense procurement? And so they have a special hub now at their airport focused on that. That's an inclusive growth. I mean, you don't leave it to the market to sort this out. You have companies working with community colleges, working with universities, working with airports, making it happen. And I think that's the potential of this industrial energy transition. An enormous amount of business opportunities are being created in this country. Again, we're bringing it back, but for whom? So I think an Erie, a Philadelphia, a Pittsburgh, the Commonwealth could be at the vanguard of this, to tell you the truth, because most other parts of the country that we have stories, but we don't have a system yet. This could be the system, right? Any thoughts on that?
No, and I just think we'll get there. There's no doubt in my mind we'll get there. This is the fraughtness of the moment. It's not the technology, it's not the industry, it's not that's all happening. It's the inclusion. The thing that keeps me up at night, and what I said to Bruce before, is these tools that Bruce and people like I and Ed Glazer and Mike Porter at Harvard built about clusters and talent and place-based development, that didn't happen overnight. When you and I met, most of those tools weren't developed. It took 20 years to develop them. Now I think we're beginning to see how do we extend that toolkit to include inclusion. We're only about 5 years deeply into that. But I think in the next 10 to 15 years, and it can be done. It's done in most other places. I actually think the biggest problem confronting the United States it is our divisions and the lack of opportunity or the lack of inclusion in our society. That's the one thing that I think we're going to have to figure out how to tackle. And here's what worries. This is what keeps me up at night. People talk about the rise of the rest. And when they talk about the rise of the rest, they talk about innovation moving from San Francisco to Austin or to Miami or to Nashville. What worries me is if we don't get these divisions solved and don't become more inclusive and don't get a handle on kind of homelessness and urban disorder, the people who came here to help power us from foreign countries will decide that they don't want to be here. That's the one thing that keeps me up at night. They'll say, I don't know. I mean, I like America, and it was fun when I was single, but when I have kids, I might want to go home to Italy, Switzerland, UK, India, China. And for the first time, even in Toronto, I hear that among our students. For the first time in my life, I hear the students saying, North America, Canada, and the US are nice, but maybe when I have a family, I'll go home. And that's why I think this issue of divisiveness, of inequity and of inclusion is so, I don't think it's just a social issue. It is. It is predominantly a social issue. Wow. And I should know better from playing in rock bands. But it is also, it is nested in an economic issue, and that's why I think we need to get a handle on it.
Yeah, it's amazing to see how the rest of the world thinks about us, because I was just in Britain, and they think the U.S., because of market dynamics and tensions, but also national investment, and because of our sort of financial system, is just going to blow a whole bunch of countries away on innovation. But our Achilles heel is inequity and partisan division. You know, if we could conquer those, which is, we may deal with inequity quicker than partisan division. But
I think one of the things that we've been able to do, you and I, Bruce, and some others, at the local, less so at the federal level, but to show that certain issues that were typically thought of as social issues or as not economically important are economically important. And I think this one is so as well. And whether we like it or not, Americans and business leaders and chambers of commerce and competitiveness councils, if you show them a social problem that they can't get their hands around, they'll go like, oh, that's terrible, but it's not part of my mission. But if you can link it somehow to how important it is to our innovative and technological and economic future, it becomes part of it. Now, I'm not saying I don't want to reduce every issue to an economic issue, but I do think that's what you were hearing, that some of these issues that we thought of as social issues are social issues, but they're also important to our economic future.
let's do a time check. What time is it? I have no idea. I don't wear a watch, and I don't. Oh, it's 2 o'clock. Oh, how much more time? Okay. I'm going to do some speed stuff here.
Okay.
Off of our questions, which are brilliant. We're a secular society. Michael DeSantis wants to know what's likely to become of sacred spaces in our cities.
Wow, this is really interesting. 13 years at Queen of Peace Boys School in North Arlington, New Jersey. And my kids are in Jewish school. I'm not Jewish. My kids are in Temple Beth Shalom School in Miami Beach in the winter. So I think, look, I think we have become a secular society, at least part of it. I think part of our division is that people who are resisting this, I think change happens fast, and fast change leaves people uneasy. Some people look forward, and some people look backward. And some people grab on to tradition. So I think that religion in some quarters of society, particularly in the South, not only in the South, is playing a bigger role than ever. I also think that we have to develop new forms of community which are not just religious. And I think that's what's happening in so many communities. I think people are desperately looking in a post-industrial knowledge-based society for sources of community that are substitutes for religion. And you know, you all can see this. You can see this in the rise of community activities and community groups. You even see it in people flocking to these big concerts. They're not religious, but they're quasi. You know, one of my friends who's in music said, if you look at musicians, at some point they all turn back to gospel. He's 100% right. They all turn back to gospel. Even Bruce Springsteen, this kid from the Garden State, his concerts now seem like gospel experiences more than concerts. So have we figured this out? No, but Robert Putnam was right. He hit something fundamentally important when he said we are all searching for new forms of social capital. The old forms of social capital, churches, Kiwanis clubs, bowling leagues have eroded. Have we figured that out? No. But I think this is a big thing, and especially in a mobile society, it's hard to forge what we're searching for.
Just one aside, I was just at a KC Chiefs game on Sunday, and all anyone wanted to talk about was Taylor Swift. And so I texted one of my daughters, and I said, who is this again, and what does she do?
Hold on, Bruce. You know where I was on Sunday? I was watching the Taylor Swift concert movie with my two kids.
Yeah, that's so frightening. We talk a lot about the eds. Let's talk about the meds. How do cities leverage up their healthcare institutions?
This is super interesting. And I think about it more in the context of a super huge city like Toronto, but I think it's also really interesting for you. If you think about the two big consumers of space in cities, and I think about Toronto, where we need so much affordable housing, it's our universities, which are mostly all in the city, and our healthcare complex, which is all in our urban downtown. And I keep saying that they're not only sources of technology, they're sources of real estate. And as we rethink our downtowns, we should be rethinking of how to reuse space in an environment like this and reprogram it, and space in the hospital complexes. So I think that as anchor institutions, they are part of what we need to rethink and rebuild how people work, how people live. I actually think in my universe, like, I have a really nice office, I probably use it for 3 hours a week. Now, do I really need that office? No. I don't really need that office. Could we use it better? Yes, we certainly could. So I think a couple of things. One, the medical community, well, I have a lot of time for the US medical system. There are a lot of issues I have with it, but we've learned how to deliver healthcare to communities more a decentralized way better than most. We have access, it costs money and it's not even, but we have access to really high quality healthcare. I think that medical issues and extension of life will become increasingly important. Wellness and fitness will become increasingly important. The medical community needs to pay attention to that. And then from the point of view of space, they're just really interesting to think of. How do we reuse and most efficiently use urban space around our anchor institutions of eds and meds?
Quick question about sprawl. We've been through periods of distended metropolitan areas and beyond because of choices of people and companies. Then we had a rebirth of cities. Now with a lot of the reshoring, a lot of the large facilities that we're seeing, the electric vehicle plants, semiconductors, are at the periphery of metros. Are we going to see another burst of industrial-led sprawl? How do you think about that?
Well, you know, I love America so much, but there are certain things that I find challenging about it. There's something in the American psyche that really doesn't like cities. And you call that the Jefferson, whatever you want to call it. And you see it now where our media is so gleeful to predict the end of New York, San Francisco, Chicago, and other great cities. And then you think, if those cities die, all of America dies. Like, why would you gleefully project it? You might say, well, it's happening and we should stop it, but you shouldn't be cheering it on. And so I think there is something in the American psyche that is anti-urban and that somehow thinks the countryside is better or more pristine or more natural or more freedom, whatever it is. Yes, it very much worries me with these new digital technologies that we will continue to stretch out. And at some point, it has to become a competitive disadvantage. That this inefficient use of land and space and this stretching and sprawling, at some point it has to become, because it costs money in commuting time, it costs money in energy, it creates all kinds of diseconomies, but as of yet it has not, maybe because we're so darn innovative and so darn productive. But yeah, it worries me a lot. And I think that's another one of our Achilles heels. That said, I think people go sprawl because, you know, the old saying, drive till you qualify. People move out further and further because they want to buy a house or they want to get a place for their people to live. So maybe another solution is developing more efficient infill housing that's more attractive to families, closer by where they can save time. But yeah, we're going to have to do some work there.
Related to that, and then Ben will tell us when to shut up, is climate. So how does a place like Erie, access to the lake, access to water, affordable housing, how does Erie make a transition to a world where the energy we use will be renewable, where we're going to distribute it in different ways, where our buildings are going to be energy efficient, where our vehicles are going to be energy efficient? How does a place like Erie make this transition?
Yeah, so first I want to say the more obvious thing. We have a house in Toronto, like all good Canadians. We're snowbirds. I didn't know what a snowbird was. We have a place in Miami Beach. And for the longest time, I thought Miami Beach was fantastic until the past couple of years, until the thought of living there for the school year. I mean, What we have done this year, we have seen, it's boiling. I mean, you cannot even imagine. It's like 50 days with a heat index over 105. Never mind Phoenix, where it's just, and now you're starting to see stories. Is the Sun Belt really habitable anymore? Who would have thought? So I think the one thing that it's becoming clear, I actually think we're going to see now a significant movement of population back to the Northeast, parts of the Northeast, and the Midwest, or the Rust Belt, or the Heartland. And here's why. One reason is climate. It's just milder. It's not as cold here. It still snows, but it doesn't snow quite as much. And if you look at the climate on a 9-12-month basis, it's better than it is in much of the Sun Belt. 2, it's the last place in America where housing is affordable. That's it. Nashville's not affordable, Miami's not affordable, Austin's not affordable, Dallas isn't affordable. They're all not affordable anymore after the pandemic. Housing is still affordable here. And because of all the investments that have made throughout this part of the world, there are still colleges and universities and good school systems. Maybe our urban school systems are challenged, but there's still access to good suburban school systems. So I think that's coming. Look, I think right now a lot of parts of this country are punting on this. There's a negative reaction to ESG, and I built the whole environmental assessment framework and impact framework for a major real estate company. I know a lot about this stuff. But I think it's coming. It is coming. Now, we might say it's not coming for the next 5 years or 10 years, but the bill is coming due. So with regard to our energy sources, electric power, what did Brendan Fitzwallace, who runs Fifth Wall, which is the largest property tax venture capital investment firm in the world, says that 40% of all the emissions is coming from our building stock. So yeah, that means not just electric batteries in our cars. That means the way we build has to change, and I think that's 2 components. One, new building materials, which have less carbon, energy efficiency in our buildings, but also more compact footprint.
So last question is, what could be Erie's attraction? Because this is such a special place. Now, I think to some extent you may have kept its specialness secret. Because when you go out to the lake, and Mary Treadway brought me out to the lake, and I'm like, oh my God. I thought the Bayfront was the lake. I grew up in Brooklyn, New York, so we didn't really know about lakes.
This is real.
I thought the Bayfront was the lake. And then you go out to the lake and go, oh, now I get it, So what could be Erie's attraction?
So, do you want to start?
What do
you think? And then I'll tell you what I think.
I think it gets back to what Richard and I were talking about before. There's a whole bunch of very large dynamics that basically could be pushing industry and people north around this confluence of manufacturing. You were very, very good at this. Innovation and a different way of living our lives. The first wave of reindustrialization in the United States is happening mostly in the South, and it's happening at the periphery of metropolitan areas. You could be the second wave, a second wave that is more city and metropolitan led, more integrated, more inclusive, essentially building the cities and metropolitan areas of the future. With all this money coming, this is a delivery question, right? Do you have you have the eds, you have the meds, you have a just gorgeous place. I mean, absolutely breathtaking, incredible downtown. This is really about a moment for us having a narrative that you could put forward, both to homegrown industries and other firms that are looking to be here and people. We are going to be the place to invent the next economy. So I think your attraction is partly a lot of things that Richard and I have been talking about. More affordable, still, cohesive, right? Yep. In its physicality, in its economy. But now this is a question of intentionality and purpose. Are you going to seize the future? Are you going to win this decade and beyond? The feds are just throwing money over the fence and running in the opposite direction. That's their job. They're investors. They're not strategists. You're the strategists. So I think you've got the ingredients, but they're multiple. They're not 1, they're not 2, they're not 3. And you've got to basically pull it all together.
I can't help but think it's the water. And it's having a great, strong town by the water. It's not just water. And let me tell you why. I know a lot about Michigan because my wife's family there, and the first thing that came to mind when I thought about Michigan's future is not Detroit, it's Traverse City. And I said the future of Michigan, a large part of the future is that Traverse City is so, now remember, when I started this, when I met Bruce, and when I met our friend Tim McNulty, who put me on the Team Pennsylvania board, these lakes were still polluted. I mean, they were still pretty messy. Tim was at the Council of Great Lakes Governors and helped to build the Great Lakes Protection Fund. And I remember I was talking about economic development and he was talking about cleaning up the lakes. And here we are, 25 years later. And I didn't think it could be done, but here we are. They're unbelievably magnificent. So I think in many ways the waterfronts are our futures. And I think you have a waterfront next to a town with a university that has attractions, that is rebuilding, and I think that's what you can really offer people. A very high quality, now it's hard to think about. The water was polluted, there was a lot of poverty, industry moved out, but you almost have to, it's hard to reframe, especially when it's hard to reframe when you live through it, but you've lived through it. And I think thinking long and hard about the appeal of that water to the future and to future generations of people who are looking for a great place to live and work. And here's what my caution would be. Every place I've gone in the past 10 years, I've said the same thing and been laughed out of the room. I'm sure you're going to laugh me out of the room here. When I went to Nashville 10 or 15 years ago and I said, if you do what you think you're going to do with this country music and music scene, and you think you're going to be one of these cities and you're intentional about it, your housing's going to get expensive. So think now about how you keep your housing affordable. When I went to Bentonville, Arkansas, 7 years ago, and sat there with the Walton family, and they laid out their plans for what they wanted to do to Bentonville, Arkansas, I said, guys, just put this on the little bottom of your agenda. Think about how to keep affordable housing. And people burst out into like hysterical laughter. You know what I did last year? I wrote the affordable housing strategy for Bentonville, Arkansas. Think about that. I know it sounds so far off and so remote and so insane. Right now, the intentionality that you've given to leveraging the university, leveraging your corporate campus, leveraging your downtown, begin to think about how you maintain and keep your community the kind of community that your kids and other young people can afford to buy a house and live in the future. And I would say that would be my single most important recommendation, to make sure that your place remains affordable for future generations.
So blue economy, affordable housing. Let's thank Richard Florida. It's been wonderful to be here.